The twilight cityscape viewed from the high-rise Manhattan office window resembled Carolyn Morrison's life itself. The view from such heights was beautiful, yet somehow lonely, with an unreachable distance. She stood by the window and checked her smartphone once more. There was a message from her mother displayed on the screen. "Carolyn, it's been a year since your father passed away. Brenda and I want to repair our relationship. Would you please contact us?" Carolyn sighed deeply. As vice president of Morrison Investments, she was known on Wall Street as the Iron Lady. However, when it came to family matters, her steel-like heart easily wavered. Memories of her father George came vividly to mind. When she was 10 years old, her parents divorced after a fierce argument. Carolyn chose to live with her father, becoming estranged from her mother Martha and sister Brenda. Her father was a strict educator and businessman. Carolyn's financial success was all thanks to his guidance. "I never expected to hear from Mother." Carolyn took a sip of coffee and returned to her desk. She remembered the day her father died. His last words before suddenly collapsing from a heart attack were, "Carolyn, be careful." At the time, she thought it was general advice, but now she couldn't help wondering if there had been some other meaning behind it. A few days later, Carolyn invited her mother and sister to dinner at her home. Her spacious mansion in the New York suburbs was purchased with part of the assets inherited from her father. When the doorbell rang, she felt her heartbeat quicken. "Carolyn, it's been a while." When she opened the door, there stood her mother Martha. Traces of her former beauty remained, but a hard life had left deep lines on her face. Behind her was Carolyn's sister Brenda, wearing flashy makeup and cheap jewelry, with a somewhat anxious expression. "Welcome, both of you." Carolyn invited them in with a smile. Though part of her remained cautious, she tried to greet them as warmly as possible. After showing them to the living room, Martha looked around and let out a small sigh. "What a magnificent house."
Can you imagine making $10,000 a month just from YouTube, all from home? That's exactly what I did with Reddit Stories. No face, no voice. Check the link in the description if you're curious.
"What your father left you was substantial, wasn't it?" There was a hint of bitterness in those words. Carolyn quickly tried to change the subject. "Please have some wine. And dinner will be ready soon." The conversation was awkward at first but gradually became more relaxed. Martha and Brenda spoke about Father George with more compassion than she could have imagined before. "Your father was cold toward us, but he truly treasured you." Martha seemed to tear up slightly. "With Dad gone, we realized our mistakes," Brenda added. "Family should be cherished." Although Carolyn felt something slightly off about their attitude, she suppressed that feeling out of her desire to bridge the years of estrangement. She stood before the fireplace where her father's photograph was displayed and raised her glass. To Father's memory. That night, they reminisced about the past. On the surface, it was a pleasant time, but Carolyn couldn't help noticing something calculated in the occasional glances exchanged between her mother and sister. A few weeks later, Carolyn was surprised by a phone call from Martha. "Let's go on a trip to Hawaii. The three of us." "Hawaii?" "Yes. For the first anniversary of George's death, I want to make a fresh start as a family. Brenda is excited about it too." Carolyn hesitated. Work was busy, and the sudden proposal caught her off guard. However, since her father's death, she had felt intensely lonely. Even if the relationship with her mother and sister wasn't fully mended, they were her only blood relatives. "All right, let's go on the trip." Carolyn took charge of arranging the airline tickets. During the preparations, it became clear that Martha and Brenda's financial situation was worse than she had thought. Martha was living solely on her pension, and Brenda didn't have a stable job. "How have you two been living since Dad passed away?" Carolyn asked. "It's been difficult," Martha answered quietly. "George gave you a luxurious life, but he left us almost nothing." Carolyn felt a pang in her chest at those words. After the divorce, her father had shown little interest in her mother and sister. She herself had rarely thought about them. A sense of guilt enveloped her. On the day of departure, Carolyn met her mother and sister at JFK Airport. Under Martha's makeup, which was trying to make her look younger, signs of fatigue were visible. Brenda was wearing what looked like new clothes, but Carolyn could see the tags were still attached. "I'm looking forward to Hawaii." Brenda smiled innocently. "This is the first trip for the three of us as a family." Carolyn responded with a smile, but deep down something bothered her. There was something unnatural about her mother and sister's attitude, an orchestrated intimacy, as if following a script. However, she ignored her intuition. She told herself this was a chance to rebuild bonds with the family she had been separated from for years. Looking at her father's watch she had inherited, Carolyn made a silent vow. "Let's put the past behind us. I'll think about the future now." Honolulu International Airport was bustling with tourists. People wearing brightly colored aloha shirts moved through the lobby, and the scent of tropical flowers wafted through the air. Carolyn checked in their luggage and received the boarding passes. "We still have 2 hours," Martha said, looking up at the large clock in the airport. "Shall we do some shopping?" Brenda's eyes lit up. "I want to look at perfumes in the duty-free shop." "Want to come along, Carolyn?" Carolyn took out her planner. "Sorry, I'd like to check my work emails." "You two go ahead." "But you're on vacation." Martha frowned. "You should relax a little." Carolyn smiled and shook her head. "I'll finish quickly." "Could you watch my luggage?" "We can't, we have our own bags," Brenda answered swiftly. "And I need both hands for the duty-free shop." "Come on, Mom, let's go." After they left, Carolyn sat in a corner of the lounge and opened her laptop. While checking her work emails, she occasionally glanced at her watch. Her father's Rolex was the only luxury he had allowed himself in life. The day before he died, he had given her this watch from his hospital bed, saying, "Time is the most valuable asset. And in family, there are those who steal time. Be careful." At the time, she thought it was just delirium. But now, as the reunion with her mother and sister progressed, those words began to take on new meaning. Time passed, an hour, then an hour and a half. Carolyn looked around. Her mother and sister were nowhere to be seen. The duty-free shop shouldn't be that large. Anxiety crossed her mind, and she stood up and walked toward the store. Just then, Martha and Brenda appeared. Both seemed a little out of breath. "Where were you?" "I was worried," Carolyn questioned. "We just went to the bathroom," Brenda shrugged. "And we looked around some shops." Martha smiled, seemingly trying to ease Carolyn's concerns. "Oh, you were worried about us. That's sweet. It means our family bond is returning." Carolyn noticed Brenda had no shopping bags. "Didn't you buy anything?" "Nothing caught my eye," Brenda answered quickly. "Anyway, isn't it almost boarding time?" Carolyn checked her watch. "Yes, let's head to security." On the way to the security checkpoint, Carolyn noticed Brenda and Martha whispering something to each other. When she turned around, they immediately stopped talking. Brenda tried to give a bright smile, but her eyes weren't smiling. "I need to go to the restroom," Brenda suddenly said. She grabbed Carolyn's arm. "Won't you come with me?" "But the boarding time." "It'll be quick, I promise." Brenda looked at her with pleading eyes. "I have something to talk about, woman to woman." Carolyn reluctantly agreed. Martha said she would wait on a bench, and the two headed to the women's restroom. Under the fluorescent lights, Brenda's face looked strangely pale. She quickly glanced around as if checking the surroundings, then led Carolyn to the farthest stall. "I actually have something to tell you," Brenda lowered her voice. "It's about Mom, she's been acting strange lately." Carolyn raised her eyebrows in surprise. "What do you mean?" Her memory seems to have gaps sometimes. And occasionally, she behaves oddly, Brenda said with a concerned expression. Don't tell anyone about this. I don't want to ruin the trip. Carolyn nodded worriedly. I understand. But maybe she should see a doctor. Oh, and Brenda suddenly changed the subject and took out a small cloth bag from her handbag. Could you keep this for me? What is this? Mom's medication, Brenda said in a low voice. But she doesn't like managing it herself. If you keep it in your bag, I can give it to her discreetly later. Carolyn took the small bag. It was a light cloth bag, and it seemed to contain some powdery substance. Is this really medicine? Of course, Brenda answered, looking a bit irritated. Are you doubting me? We're family. Those words stung Carolyn's heart. She felt ashamed for doubting. After years of estrangement, now was the time to rebuild trust. She silently put the bag in her handbag. Thank you, Brenda smiled, looking relieved. Now, let's go back. When they left the restroom, Martha was engrossed in a phone conversation. As they approached, she hurriedly hung up and gave an unnatural smile. Well, it's time to go now. Upon arriving at the security checkpoint, it was more crowded than expected. Carolyn checked her ticket and placed her shoes in the tray. Martha and Brenda were queued slightly behind her. You two go ahead, Carolyn said. I want to check my business emails once more. They exchanged glances, communicating something with their eyes. Carolyn felt a strange sensation about this but didn't think deeply about it since she was in a hurry. By the time she finished checking her emails, Martha and Brenda had already passed through security and appeared to be discussing something on the other side. Carolyn placed her bag on the conveyor belt and headed toward the metal detector. When she turned around, she noticed her mother and sister watching her from a distance. There seemed to be expectation in Martha's eyes and tension in Brenda's expression. Carolyn wondered about this but quickly passed through the security gate so as not to keep other passengers waiting. Excuse me, ma'am. The inspector monitoring the X-ray scanner suddenly stopped Carolyn. Her bag was displayed on the screen, and the inspector was looking at it with a serious expression. May I check your bag? Carolyn tried to remain calm despite her agitation. Of course, is there a problem? The inspector didn't answer but moved her handbag to another table. With gloved hands, he carefully searched through the bag and took out the small cloth bag Brenda had given her. What is this? It's my mother's medication. My sister gave it to me, Carolyn answered confidently. The inspector opened the bag and checked the contents. His expression changed dramatically. Ma'am, could you come with me? We need to talk in a separate room. Carolyn turned around in confusion. There stood Martha and Brenda. They were watching her from a distance, and they were quietly smiling. This way, please. The airport security officer's voice was cold and commanding. Carolyn couldn't believe her ears. In her life, she had never broken the law. In the investment world, ethics and integrity were valued above all else. She never imagined being taken to a room for questioning. The small white room had a metal table and chairs, and posters listing airport safety regulations hung on the walls. There were no windows, and the door made a heavy sound when it closed. The inspector, still wearing rubber gloves, placed Carolyn's handbag on the table and took out the cloth bag in question. Ms. Morrison, could you explain this? The inspector opened the bag and took out some of the contents. A white powdery substance. Carolyn saw the contents of the bag clearly for the first time and felt the blood drain from her face. This is not mine, she said in a trembling voice. My sister gave it to me just before we went to the bathroom. She said it was my mother's medication. Is that so? Skepticism seeped into the inspector's voice. Do you know what kind of medication it is? No, I don't know specifically. Carolyn's thoughts were rapidly organizing themselves. The cloth bag. White powder. Brenda's unnatural behavior. And the strange looks from her mother and sister. Wait, this is a misunderstanding. I was tricked. The inspector looked at her calmly. Many people say that. We will test this white powder. In the meantime, please wait here. Please call my mother and sister. They can confirm this. Carolyn pleaded desperately. The inspector nodded silently and left the room. Carolyn wiped her sweaty palms on her skirt. In her head, warning sirens were blaring. Her father's last words. Martha and Brenda's sudden appearance. Talk of wealth. And now, this bag of white powder. Everything was starting to connect. The door opened, and a man who appeared to be a senior inspector entered, along with a uniformed police officer. Carolyn's heart nearly stopped. Ms. Morrison, preliminary tests indicate this substance is suspected to be cocaine, the senior inspector said with a stern expression. This is a serious crime. No. Carolyn raised her voice. I didn't have anything like that. My sister Brenda gave it to me, saying it was my mother's medication. In the bathroom, when we were alone. The police officer took notes while asking, where is this bathroom located? Near the departure gate. It was just before boarding. Surveillance cameras? The senior inspector asked. Carolyn was stunned. There are no surveillance cameras inside restrooms. No evidence. I don't think there are cameras, but please ask my mother and sister. They must know. We've spoken with your relatives, the police officer calmly answered. Your mother and sister denied giving you any medication. They also denied going to the bathroom with you. Carolyn's blood froze. What? Both of them testified that you went to the bathroom alone. Also, your mother added, the police officer continued, looking at his notes, Carolyn has recently seemed mentally unstable due to work stress. That's a lie. Carolyn shouted. Her heart was now trembling with fear and anger. This is their plot. They're trying to frame me. Why would they do such a thing? The senior inspector calmly asked. Carolyn took a deep breath, trying to calm herself. Panicking wouldn't solve anything. She had overcome numerous crises in the investment world. Now she needed that calmness. It's been a year since my father died. He left most of his property to me. My mother and sister inherited very little. They suddenly contacted me recently, saying they wanted to repair our relationship. Carolyn stated the facts. And they suggested this trip as well. The police officer raised an eyebrow, showing interest. Do you have evidence regarding the property? I have a copy of my father's will at home. You can also check with the lawyer, Robert Finch. They stared at her in silence. In the windowless room, Carolyn was beginning to lose her sense of time. How much time had passed? An hour? 2 hours? The flight to Hawaii has already departed, the senior inspector announced. At this point, you are being detained on suspicion of drug possession. Please wait here until the results of the formal drug test are available. Carolyn was overcome with despair. Can I call a lawyer? Of course, that's your right. Before the police officer left the room, Carolyn took a chance and asked, where are my mother and sister now? They're waiting in another room. Please let me see them, Carolyn begged. The police officer exchanged glances with the senior inspector, and after a while, nodded. Just for a short time. After they left the room, Carolyn held her head in her hands. She now clearly understood her father's words. Be careful. He had known the true nature of Martha and Brenda. The door opened, and Martha and Brenda entered. There was no trace of concern or worry in their expressions. Martha's eyes held a cold satisfaction, and a small smile played on Brenda's lips. Why? Carolyn asked in a trembling voice. Martha sat down and elegantly crossed her legs. Your father abandoned me and Brenda. He chose only you. And he left us nothing, Brenda continued. You live in luxury. We struggle with debt. But why this? Carolyn's words trailed off. It's simple, Martha laughed coldly. There's a special clause in your father's will. Didn't you know? If you lose your ability to manage assets, perhaps by going to prison, the administrative rights to the inheritance transfer to us. Carolyn was dumbfounded. She had heard an overview of the will from the lawyer, but she didn't know about such a clause. Or perhaps it had been mentioned, but she hadn't considered it important. This can't be. The plan was perfect, Brenda said proudly. You get arrested, go to prison for drug possession. And we get everything. I'll tell the police. I'll tell them everything, Carolyn threatened. Go ahead, Martha shrugged. But there's no evidence, is there? No surveillance cameras in the bathroom. We've already testified that you went to the bathroom alone. Despair overwhelmed Carolyn. They were right. There was no evidence. And drugs were actually found in her bag. Who would believe her story? Father saw through you, Carolyn said quietly. Martha's expression clouded for a moment. George was always shrewd. That's why we had to take measures with him too. Carolyn's heart nearly stopped. What did you do to Father? The door opened, and the police officer entered. Time's up. Martha and Brenda stood up. They looked down at Carolyn with satisfied expressions. Goodbye, Carolyn, Martha said. We'll visit you sometime. After they left, Carolyn remained in deep loneliness and despair. Her life was about to collapse. And she had no means to stop it. After a long time had passed, the door opened, and a middle-aged man in a suit entered. Ms. Morrison, I'm attorney James Connor. I received a call from the airport. Please help me, Carolyn pleaded desperately. I've been framed. Attorney Connor nodded quietly. I understand your situation. First, let's request urine and hair tests. If we can prove you're not a drug user, the situation will change. But possession of drugs is. One more thing, the attorney interrupted. I received interesting information from an airport employee. Just before you went to the bathroom with Brenda, a young couple waiting to board was taking a selfie video. You and Brenda might be visible in the background of that video. Hope returned to Carolyn's eyes. Really? I've requested a check, Attorney Connor smiled gently. If the video captures the moment Brenda handed something to you, it would be crucial evidence supporting your claim. Carolyn exhaled deeply. There was still hope. The couple. They've already headed to Hawaii, but the airport staff secured their contact information, the attorney said in a calm voice. Ms. Morrison, this might be a difficult battle ahead. But the truth will eventually come to light. Carolyn stared at her father's watch. It was as if her father was watching over her. Anger and determination welled up inside her. She wouldn't let her mother and sister's plan succeed. She would reveal the truth and also uncover the true circumstances of her father's death. I will fight, Carolyn said quietly but firmly. I cannot lose. The holding cell at the Honolulu police station was cleaner than Carolyn had imagined. Nevertheless, the sensation of being caged was unbearable. She gazed at the morning sun streaming through the barred window, reflecting on the nightmarish 24 hours. Ms. Morrison. Attorney Connor appeared with a leather briefcase full of documents. There was a slight glimmer of hope in his expression. I have good news, he said quietly. The results of the urine and hair tests are in. No drug traces were detected in your system at all. Carolyn sighed with relief. But that alone isn't. The suspicion that you were merely a carrier remains, yes, Attorney Connor nodded. However, we have more crucial evidence. He took out a tablet and showed it to Carolyn. The screen displayed footage from the airport. A young couple taking a selfie with a selfie stick. And in the background of that frame, Carolyn and Brenda were visible. The moment when Brenda handed the small bag to Carolyn was clearly recorded. "This is..." Carolyn's voice trembled. "Decisive evidence," Attorney Connor said with satisfaction. The couple was on vacation but willingly provided the video after being contacted by the police. They were cooperative in proving your innocence. Tears welled up in Carolyn's eyes. The kindness of strangers had saved her. "Furthermore, I've examined your father's will," the lawyer continued. "As you suspected, there was a special clause. If you lost your ability to manage assets, the administrative rights to the property would transfer to Martha and Brenda. They were aiming for that from the beginning," Carolyn said painfully. The lawyer nodded quietly. "The police have also investigated their phone records. Brenda's cell phone contained recordings of conversations about the plan to frame you." "What kind of content?" "Martha saying, 'If Carolyn goes to prison, we can get everything,'" Attorney Connor frowned. "Even more serious is the mention of your father's death." Carolyn's blood froze. Father's death? In Martha and Brenda's conversation, there were the words, "Like George, she too has become a nuisance." The lawyer carefully chose his words. "The police have determined that the cause of your father's death needs to be reinvestigated. Father died of a heart attack." Carolyn's voice caught in her throat. "That's the official cause. However, certain drugs can induce symptoms of a heart attack," the lawyer quietly explained. "The police plan to request a re-examination of George's body." Carolyn covered her face with trembling hands. Her worst fears were becoming reality. Her father might have been murdered. And she was about to suffer the same fate. "The release procedures are progressing," Attorney Connor changed the subject. "Since the evidence is clear, the drug possession charges have been dropped. Martha and Brenda have been arrested and are currently being questioned." "I want to see them," Carolyn said with determination. "That's not advisable," the lawyer expressed concern. "No, I need to. I want to look them in the eyes and ask why they did this." Carolyn's voice was strong and unwavering. A few hours later, having completed the release procedures, Carolyn was facing Martha and Brenda in the police station's interrogation room. Both were handcuffed and looked tired. Martha was staring at Carolyn with hate-filled eyes, while Brenda was looking at the floor. "Why?" Carolyn asked quietly. "Why would you do this to father, to me?" Martha sneered. "Why? Your father abandoned us. When you were 10, he abused me and pushed me to financial ruin. Meanwhile, you grew up receiving all his affection. Don't you think that's unfair?" "Father, abusive?" "That can't be," Carolyn objected. "Of course, that's how it would have appeared to you," Martha's voice was bitter. "He played the perfect father in front of you. But he showed us a different face." Brenda finally looked up. Tears were in her eyes. "We grew up poor. While you were attending an expensive private school, I was being bullied in public school. The child support from Dad wasn't enough." Carolyn was confused. Her father had always told her, "I provide sufficient financial support to Martha and Brenda." Which was the truth? But that doesn't justify framing someone or killing them. Carolyn cried out. "It was to survive," Martha said quietly. "Your father died, and yet he left us nothing. Only you inherited everything. Do you think that's fair?" Carolyn couldn't answer. Anger and confusion swirled within her. "I'll have your father's cause of death investigated," she said coldly. "If you killed my father, you'll both get life sentences." Martha and Brenda's expressions froze. Fear flashed in their eyes. Leaving the interrogation room, Carolyn said to Attorney Connor, who was waiting, "Whatever the truth, I want to bring everything to light." "If you're prepared for that," the lawyer nodded quietly. "Just remember, the truth often comes with pain." Are you ready? Carolyn looked at her father's watch, his last gift to her. Yes, I'm prepared to accept any truth. Attorney Connor gently placed his hand on Carolyn's shoulder. You are not alone. I'll accompany you on this journey ahead. Carolyn smiled faintly. Thank you. As they left the airport, Hawaii's warm sun greeted her. The family trip she had planned had turned into a nightmare, but paradoxically, this event had given her the courage to face new truths. The real circumstances of her father's death. The true reasons for her mother and sister's hatred. And her own identity. A long journey to find answers to all these questions was just beginning. 1 year later, the visiting room of a New York prison was surrounded by impersonal gray walls. Martha and Brenda sat on the opposite side of the table, wearing prison uniforms. They looked weakened and aged. Carolyn faced them quietly. Thank you for coming to visit, Brenda said in a small voice. Carolyn nodded silently. The reinvestigation of her father's cause of death revealed that his heart attack had been induced by a special toxin that couldn't occur naturally. Martha and Brenda had been found guilty of first-degree murder and were serving long sentences. Why did you come? Martha looked at Carolyn with tired eyes. The hatred had disappeared from her voice. I wanted to understand, Carolyn answered quietly. Why you hated us so much. After a long silence, Martha began to speak. Before marrying your father, he was the son of a wealthy family. But he didn't continue the family business, choosing instead to start his own. He experienced failures and successes. When we divorced, he hadn't yet achieved success. Later, he became very successful. But by then, Brenda and I had been cut off from his life. Father was paying child support, Carolyn said quietly. Yes, the minimum, Martha gave a bitter smile. But when he died, you received an inheritance worth millions of dollars. We had nothing but debt. Carolyn remained silent. She knew the truth from her father's lawyer. Her father had indeed sent more support than just child support, but Martha had lost most of it through gambling and failed investments. However, she didn't point this out. It no longer mattered. I won't say I forgive you, Carolyn quietly announced. But I do sometimes wonder what your lives might have been like if things had been different. After the visit, Carolyn left the prison. Outside, Attorney Connor was waiting. He had been her support throughout the year. Not just as a lawyer, but as a friend. Are you okay? He gently asked. Yes, Carolyn smiled. It was necessary. As they walked through Central Park, they discussed Carolyn's new project. She had used part of her father's inheritance to establish the Morrison Family Foundation. It was a foundation to support families in difficult situations. I've learned that blood ties alone don't make a family, Carolyn said, gazing at the light filtering through the trees. You, the couple who provided that video at the airport, my colleagues at work, they were strangers, but they saved me. That's what family bonds really are, don't you think? Connor smiled gently. That's exactly right. As they sat on a bench, a little girl ran past them chasing a ball. Her mother followed, catching up and embracing her. At that sight, tears welled up in Carolyn's eyes. The first project of my foundation will be a support program for children whose parents are in prison, Carolyn said. I want to break the cycle of hatred. Connor took her hand. That's a wonderful idea. Carolyn gazed at her father's watch. I think Dad was wrong. There's something more precious than time. It's the bonds we choose. She smiled, ready to take a new step. To walk the path leading to the future with the family she had chosen, beyond the pain of the past.